seminar, we did an organization called India Discovery Center, which I had in mind for a long time, but some people joined with me a few years ago, and we are trying to create a research institution where we might understand who we are. When we say who we are immigrants in a foreign country. I'm talking about people of Indian descent in the United States. This is a new thing. Nowhere in the world Indians have gone to live. We did not know when I came 40 years ago, I will live here. I didn't know that my children would get married here. I didn't know that I would die here. The question when you back home we do not have a need to find out what we are. But by virtue of the United States, the question comes, how do you relate to other people in the world? Now, given that thought, whether there are many peoples in the world, is man is one or man is many? Is man identified by a shape, size, tongue, religion, culture, nation, geography? Or man is a biological product, evolutionary being, creation of the universe, as we saw in the previous song? Now, those things are bothersome. Who is man? Then the question is, who is an Indian? What we mean by a man of Indian descent. So in order to discover that, we thought we will kind of examine by our own means to see whether we have some answers. India is big, large, complex, multiple religions, multiple cultures, multiple people, multiple geography, food, dress, habitat, architecture, monuments, everywhere differently. So it's large. So what we have done is, we have tried to quantify it in some fashion. And you people have blessed us to be with us. We did a seminar last July called The Study of the Indus Period. So you see the posters here on my left. That's a part of that seminar. What we have done is we will make a period defined by 6 different tracks: geography and people, art and culture, language and literature, philosophy and religion, science and technology, economy and politics. So we will go from the old times to the present time to find out what this Indian unitary individual is. And to make fun of it, this is actually thought came to me when I became a grandfather. So I welcome you on behalf of my grandchildren, that hopefully we have an answer by the time we finish. Please bless the speakers who have been in the past. Some of them are here today. We have Sanjeev, we have Chandrika possibly, we do not. So anyway, the speakers of the Indus civilization, will you applaud their efforts? They were at the beginning of it. We have today the next part we call the study of the Vedic period. Vedic period, when we say, we just recited from the Vedas, but it is not confined to the Vedas. It is the Vedic period. Vedic period is a time span, so whatever happened in that period. We have a formal seminar of the 6 tracks. It goes the whole day. Now, I will ask you people to close down the cell phones if you can. then we have some food in the back, so if you feel this, then you can take food. The restrooms are downstairs, but mind that not too much of diversion, and try to see that we learn something, question, discuss. We're not scholars, we're the researchers to find out, scratching the surface. In order to coordinate today's event, I invited my friend, Professor Gopinath. Professor Gopinath and I started many years ago something called Harvard Outreach Lectures. It was an idea of Kathy Galbraith, who is no more, but also who helped us and who is here with us today, Mr. Thomas Burke. Would you kindly welcome Thomas Burke? He will speak to us a little later. So in order to orient ourselves, kindly turn off your cell phones. So here, welcome Professor Gopinath. He teaches in Suffolk University, also teaches back in India. He's a scholar, he's a business management professor, and he has a background in nonviolence and Gandhian studies. And welcome Professor C. Gopinath from Suffolk.
And now I invite Tom Burke to come up. Thomas Burke. To this audience, I would say that he's truly a person who does not need any introduction. Anyone in the greater Boston area who has any interest in Indology or Sanskrit would have come across Tom Burke in some context or the other. One word that can describe Tom, it's that he's a giving person. Tom always gives of his knowledge and his expertise in this field for so many years that every one of us owes a deep debt of gratitude to Tom for having encouraged our studies and continuing to help us in this. The formal introduction is that he is a language scholar with expertise across several languages including English, German, Latin, Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Hindi, Arabic, and Urdu. After studying in the US and Germany, he spent many years in India, teaching at the Government Sanskrit College and at the Sanskrit University in Banaras. He also served as an administrator in Harvard University with part-time faculty appointments in teaching Sanskrit, and he's an iconic resource and guide to students of Sanskrit in this area. Please welcome Tom.
Well, I'm speaking today on the differences between classical Sanskrit and Vedic Sanskrit. And that's a big topic, and I am not a real Vedic scholar, and many people here in this room will know much more Vedic than I do. But I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on some theoretical issues that we confront in this study. To begin with, European grammars very frequently call Vedic a separate language from Sanskrit. Whereas Sanskrit, the Sanskrit tradition, generally regards Vedic as a dialect of Sanskrit. Sanskrit has several dialects, one of them being Vedic. And that idea goes back to Panini. Panini, perhaps 400 BC, something of that sort. Composed about 4,000 rules regarding Sanskrit. And of those, a certain number treated of Chandas or some related words which just describe the Vedic language. He doesn't attempt to give a complete grammar of Vedic, which he really couldn't because it's so complicated. But he included Vedic within his own grammar, and that is the tradition that Indian people follow in general. Whether we see numerous related languages as dialects of one larger language, or whether we regard them as individual languages in their own right, has a very large political element in it. It's been said that a language is a dialect with an army, and so I get that perhaps will speak for itself. If you look at Arabic, for example, people from speaking Moroccans speaking their native dialect and Iraqis speaking their native dialect will have a very hard time understanding one another. And I so clearly remember when I first went to England, I was going on a boat with some longshoremen who had loaded material to that boat. And I looked at them for a long time. They looked English, but they were speaking some foreign language, I thought. And after about 15 minutes, it dawned on me they were speaking a Cockney English, which I really did not understand. It took me a long time to understand that. The difficulty about, so to a large extent, whether you regard dialects as part of one language or not will depend upon whether they are incomprehensible to one another. And this difficulty is increased when you look at historical dialects. Looking at English, it's very difficult for a person who knows only modern English to understand Beowulf. He has to have studied Old English to be able to understand that. And that same principle would govern the reading of many the relationship between many forms of older language and the modern languages. And so there is no generally accepted rule which we could use to determine whether certain groups of languages form dialects or whether they are individual languages. And there are also other methodological problems. The earliest use of the word Sanskrit seems to be in regard to language, seems to be in Valmiki's Ramayana. And there several times you get Sanskrita-vach, the perfected language which is spoken perhaps by a monkey. He's able to speak in Sanskrit. On the other hand, many people will say that Sanskrit is a historical statement. That same principle. Each individual word illustrates is evidence for the phonology and the grammar that was accepted in that stage of the language. The trouble is that you can put three words together, each of which is correct, but they will not give a proper sense. They don't fit together. In other words, they do not give the state of perfection that is expected by people who regard Sanskrit as the perfected language. In earlier times, such words as Sanskrit were regarded to cooking. If something was cooked properly, it was Sanskrit. And languages which is put together properly would then be regarded as Sanskrit, perfected. But if you take three individual words and put them together in a way that Panini would not approve, then that is no longer a Sanskrit language, although each individual word may be Sanskrit. So these two definitions of Sanskrit are incompatible, and there's no way really of combining them. One way would be to say you talk about the old Indic, the ancient Indic, that is Sanskrita, the middle Indic, which would be Prakrita, and the new Indic, which would be the various languages now spoken in India. Unfortunately, the word Sanskrita or Sanskrit is so popularly used in other senses that there's not much chance that solution would be widely adopted. When was Sanskrit first written down? In India, perhaps 5th century. But the earliest Sanskrit we have written is actually found 1,000 years earlier. And this has been mentioned very briefly in one of the previous presentations. It's found in Iraq and in Syria around 1500. And it's found Sanskrit words with regard to the names of some gods, but also with regard to horsemanship, are found in a Hurrian text and on horsemanship. And the Sanskrit words were taken obviously from Mitanni people who were of Indian origin. There's some dispute whether they were Indian or Iranian, but looking at the words they used, the form of the words, they seem to have been Indian. And they took a prominent position in the Hurrian Empire that lasted from, say, 1600 to around 1300 BC. Curiously, a couple of those words look as though they were Prakrit already. Instead of some of the words were like Theta, can't get around. Can't say Ekavarthana. But you also have Saptavarthana, not Sapta, which would be proper Sanskrit, but Sapta, which is really a Prakrit form. And so perhaps we can say that Middle Indic already existed at that time. And here we get into the question of diglossia. Diglossia is a feature in which many languages show this. You have a form of the language which is very distinct, used for formal speech, and another form which is used for ordinary speech. And this is found in India. I know in the south it's found in Bengal, the Savi Bhasha and Chalit Bhasha. And people, when they speak in public, in formal situations, would use a different set of often grammatical forms and also phonological forms to express themselves. And so it's possible that we have Prakrit even in the inscriptions we find in cuneiform writing in Syria and Iraq, 1,500 years before Sanskrit was first written in India. All right. Some of this has already been covered. I was going to mention it's covered by previous speakers, so I won't go into it. The verse plays a very important part in Indian tradition. If something is in verse, it's easy to memorize. It's very hard to memorize prose texts and then to recite them properly. The fact that it's in verse in verse, the meter will help you remember the lines properly and will alert you if you were putting in something that was not originally there or leaving out something that was there. And this people also in other countries have had real problems with writing. Socrates didn't write anything, although his pupil Plato and his grand-pupil Aristotle wrote quite a lot. In Celtic Gaul, people studied for years and years to learn the sacred texts there, but they refused to write them down. And then, as a result, we no longer have any Gallic scriptures at all. In India too, there's been a wide reluctance to write the sacred texts. And if you look at the writings of the first 5 centuries, say, the inscriptions in India, they're all apocryphal texts. You get a few graffiti here and there in Sanskrit, but you don't get Sanskrit text. The first real Sanskrit inscription is found in 150 of our era. That's 5 centuries after Sanskrit began to be written down. Obviously, people were speaking Sanskrit and using Sanskrit, but they weren't writing it. There was a reluctance to write. And verse, it should be noted, is not to be regarded as poetry. Take the Amarikosha, the best-known Sanskrit dictionary. It's in verse. It's easy to memorize a dictionary in verse. And the same thing is true of other almost all disciplines have works in verse which have been memorized by Sanskrit scholars. In the word kavya, obviously the word kavya, which we translate as poetry, comes from kavi. But in Vedic times or in earlier times, a kavi was especially a sage, a person of great insight. Later, a kavi became a poet, and not the sages totally dropped out, but that is the origin of the word kavya. And the Vedic meters are quite different from the classical meters. They're much freer in a way. Classical meters are often very closely regulated. The most common group of meters, every syllable except for the last syllable of every verse has to be long or has to be short. You have to keep that pattern. Whereas Vedic meter has guiding principles, but they're not so precisely. But there's a lot of room for individual poets to show variation. And just a few points now to talk about some of the specifics of what is different in the Vedic language from what is different in the classical Sanskrit. Vedic Sanskrit still has a retroflex L, so it has 2 L's, whereas classical Sanskrit just has the 1 L. Vedic pronunciation has a short E and O, and O, I should say, a short E and O, perhaps, which is the way they pronounce the A and O, which we find in more modern Sanskrit. These A and O sounds were used before other vowels. Some Vedic schools have particular ways of pronouncing words. The Taittiriya Sampradaya has the words Trishtuk and Anushtuk instead of Trishtub and Anushtuk, names of verses. Many Vedic, in the Vedic you have an enormous number of different forms of verbs. Many of these verbs themselves drop out of later Sanskrit. And later Sanskrit adds some, for instance, Hrinite means is angry in Vedic. You don't forget that in classical Sanskrit. But Sanskrit has such roots as lut or lunt, lutati, he robs, from which we get the word loot. Garjati, it roars. You don't find those words in classical Sanskrit. Vedic has some pronouns that don't appear in classical Sanskrit. I won't bother to go into that, but unless someone's interested, I can tell. In classical, in the Samhita texts of the Veda, they were put together later than the composition of the original hymns, and in putting together the Samhita texts, the texts which we see printed in books, already some grammatical principles were being involved. In Veda, you have chiefly an E plus some other vowel transcribed as a Y, or you see an O, O plus a vowel transcribed as V plus that vowel. What has to, time's up?
5 minutes.
Well, I've reduced it somewhat here, so good luck, I'll be done soon. So in trying to restore what the original text was, one has to say iya and not ya, or u, for example, and not va. And so in other words, the Samhita text would have Sundavegne. If we want to see the original text, the older text as written by the poets originally, it would be something like Sundavegne. Another case of something classical would be Vidvan Agne, but Vedic would have Vidvan Agne. In other words, the N, Vidvan is turned into an Anusvara, and so you have just, instead of having 4 syllables as in classical, Vidvan Agne, you have, I'm wrong. You have 4 syllables still, but the second syllable is van and not van. The word we have in Sanskrit, in Vedic Sanskrit, 2 words not. One means not, very familiar with classical Sanskrit. Another means like, and that the word na is never combined with the following vowel in Sunday. It's always kept separate. And the Vedic has the subjunctive voice. It's 3 times more common in Vedic than the optative. But the subjunctive voice in the Vedic totally drops out, and we have only the optative in classical Sanskrit. Many verbs change their conjugational pattern. In Vedic we have krinoti, 5th class verb, which becomes karoti, an 8th class verb in classical Sanskrit. So I think that that is about what I want to say. So,
I'm going to first apologize to you. I said 12 o'clock we'll have lunch. Tom, thank you so much.
oh, sure.
Now, Tom and I, we met in 1982 to learn Urdu. And here is a man who was I was trying to find the hall, and here is a man who was coming like that. I said, who is this guy? So then I asked him, do you know where the hall is? He said, I'll take you there. So he has escorted me ever since. Please, if anything is in in 1999, we started Sanskrit classes in Srilakshmi temple. And one of the people, or few people who supported it, they would be here. You saw Anantakrishnan, but I have the special privilege to introduce to you Professor Kodandapani. He taught and he learned, then he decided, then they made groups. So the product of all that, you will see in the Rudra recitation by Kodandapani. And then we will go to the philosophy. So we'll break at 1. So 1 to 1:45 we'll go for lunch, and then be with me. So good stuff there. All right. Please welcome Kodandapani on Rudra.
Thank you, Mr. He is my teacher actually. He's the one who started me to Sanskrit actually. One of the best teachers I had because the passion he has for Sanskrit actually. That's really anyhow, thank you very much and good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Right now I want to just chant 2 Anuvakas from Rudram. Sri Rudram is in the Krishna Yajurveda, Taittiriya Samhita, the book number 4, chapter 5. And Chamakam, there are 2 parts, one is called Namakam. Namakam is chapter 5, and Chamakam is chapter 7. Namakam contains the word Namaha in that. The Chamakam contains Chame. Essentially, the Sri Rudram is in the praise. The hymns are composed in to praise of Lord Shiva. The Rudra is one of the names there. And I'm going to chant only the first Anuvaka. And there are 11 Anuvakas in Namakam and 11 Anuvakas in Chamakam. The Anuvaka is like a paragraph. And I'm going to chant only, because of the constraint of time, only first and 11th. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om. Om Namo Bhagavate Rudraya. Namaste Rudramanyava Utota Ishave Namaha. Namaste Astu Dhanvane Bahubhya Mutate Namaha. Yata Ishu Shivatama Shivam Babhuvate Dhanuhu. Shivasharabhyaya tavatayano rudramudaya. Yate Rudra Shiva Tanura Khora Papakashini. Tayanastanu Vashantamaya Girishanta Pichakashi. Kamishung Girishanta Haste Vibharsyastave. Shivangiritratang Kurumahigam Hi Purushan Jagat. Shive Navachasatva Girishacha Vadamasi Yatha Nasarvamijjagada Yakshmagam Sumana Asat Adhyavojadadhi Bhakta Prathamo Daivyo Bhishak Ahigashta Sarvahan Jambhayan Sarvahashayatu Dhanyah Aso Yastamro Aruna Uta Babhrus Sumangaraha Eche Magam Rudra Abhito Yikshushrita Sahasrasho Vaishagam Hedayimahe Aso Yo Vasarpati Nilagrivo Virohita Utainam Pramunja Dhanmanas Ubhayorapni Yodyam Yaschate hasta ishabhapparata bhagavo vapa avatatya dhanustvagam sahasrakshashate shudhe nishirya shalyana mukha shivoras sumana bhava vidyandhanukapardino vishalyo balavagam uta aneshan asyeshava abhurasya nishankatihi Yade edil midhushtamahste babhuvate danuhum तयास्मान् विश्वतस्त्वमयक्ष्मया परिभुजा नमस्ते अस्त्वायुधाय नातताय धृष्णवे उभाभ्यामुत ते नमो बाहुभ्यां तव धन्वने परिते धन्वनो हेतिरस्मान् ऋणक्तु विश्वतः अथो य इषुधिस्तवारे अस्मन्निधेहितं शम्भवे नमः नमस्ते अस्तु भगवन् विश्वेश्वराय महादेवाय त्र्यम्बकाय त्रिपुरन्तकाय त्रिकाग्निकालाय कालाग्निरुद्राय नीलकण्ठाय मृत्युञ्जयाय सर्वेश्वराय सदाशिवाय श्रीमन्महादेवाय नमः. Now I am going to chant Anuvaka 11. सहस्राणि सहस्रशो ये रुद्राधिभूम्याः येषागं सहस्रयोजने वधन्वानि तन्मसि अस्मिन् महत्यर्णवेऽन्तरिक्षे भवाधि नीलग्रीवाश्रितकण्ठाः शर्वा अधः क्षमाचराः नीलग्रीवाश्रितकण्ठादिवगं रुद्रापश्रिताः ये वृक्षेषु सस्पिञ्जरा नीलग्रीवा विलोहिताः ये भूतानामधिपतयो विशिखासक्कपर्दिनः ये अन्येषु विद्यन्ति पात्रेषु पिबतो जनान् ये पथां पथिरक्षय ऐलभृदायभ्युदः ये तीर्थानि प्रचरन्ति सुखावन्तो निषङ्गिणः एतावन्तश्च भूयागंसश्च दिशो रुद्रा वितस्थिरे येषागं सहस्रयोजने वधन्वानि तन्मसि नमो रुद्रेभ्यो ये पृथिव्यां येऽन्तरिक्षे ये दिवि येषामन्नं वातो वर्षमिषवस्तेभ्यो दश प्राची दश दक्षिणा दश प्रतीची दशोदीची दशोद्भास्तेभ्यो नमस्ते नो मृडयन्तु ते यन्विष्मो यश्च नो द्वेष्टितं वो जम्भे ददामि त्र्यम्बकं यजामहे सुगन्धिं पुष्टिवर्धनम् उर्वारुकमिव बन्धनान् मृत्योर्मुक्षीय मामृतात् यो रुद्रो अग्नौ यो अप्सु य ओषधीषु यो रुद्रो विश्वा भुवना दिवेश तस्मै रुद्राय नमो अस्तु समुष्टु हि यस्विषुः सुधन्वा यो विश्वस्य क्षयति भेषजस्य इक्ष्वाहा महेहोः मनसाय रुद्रन्नमोऽभिर्देवमसुरन् दुवस्य अयं मे हस्तो भगवान् अयं मे भगवत्तरः अयं मे विश्वभेषजोऽयं शिवाभिमर्शनः एते सहस्रमयुतं पाशा मृत्योमर्त्याय हन्तवे तान् यज्ञस्य मायया सर्वानवयजामहे मृत्यवे स्वाहा मृत्यवे स्वाहा प्राणानां ग्रन्थिरसि रुद्रो भाविशान्तकः तेनान्येनाप्यायस्व ॐ नमो भगवते रुद्राय विष्णवे मृत्योर्मे पाहि ओ हरिः ॐ तत्सत् श्रीकृष्णार्पणमस्तु।